to get their second straight win. We break down the Kevin Durant-led comeback, how key contributors like Yuta Watanabe and Cam Thomas stepped up, and the general on-court feel-good vibes for Brooklyn over the last two games.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, friends. It is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day, where, of course, I am Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast with my boy, Andy Mack. We thank you, as always, for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms. And, man, on a night that looked like it maybe was going to get away from Brooklyn, on a night when if you had lost this game, all of the good vibes coming off that blowout win against the Wizards on Friday night would have been watered down, the Brooklyn Nets find a way to come back. They find a way behind Kevin Durant to have a 23-7 run to close this one out, 98-94 winners over the Charlotte Hornets on the road. And it really came down to some of the themes that we saw in Friday night's game against the Wizards, carrying over, getting lost for a time, and then getting back into the rhythm and back on track. We also, of course, thank you for being in on YouTube for the live feed here, a Saturday night special. You can catch this. You're hearing it right now on your podcast feeds Monday morning. We said we were going to try to do as many of these post games as possible. Couldn't come in after that big blowout win over the Washington Wizards on Friday night, but very happy to be in here on this one. We will talk about that previous game as well, because there are some themes that have run through the two-game win streak that the Brooklyn Nets are now on. Back into the episode, we will just update, obviously, what's going on with Kyrie Irving and any news and notes around it. But by and large, it's great to be able to keep the attention on the court and on the Brooklyn Nets basketball team, who have gotten two wins, albeit against the Wizards and against the Hornets. Here, no one's going to confuse them with being juggernauts of the Eastern Conference, but you play the schedule that's in front of you, and the Brooklyn Nets get some really nice wins here. Fatigue was obviously a factor in this one, because you saw into the fourth quarter there. Now, again, Charlotte was also on a back-to-back, but they are at home, so it makes it a little bit different for them. But by and large, two teams that had to play Friday and Saturday night, obviously. And it just looked like that in that, as you're getting through the third quarter, specifically here for Brooklyn, that it was just going to get away from them. And in the third quarter, because we'll talk about all the positives, but in the third quarter, a quarter that the Nets have struggled in so far this season in almost every single game, except for that Friday night one where everything was a blowout, 17 points for the Brooklyn Nets in that quarter. Now, as we said before, when we talk about what's gone well and what hasn't, you have to acknowledge that in that third quarter, as in the first and the second and the fourth, there were good looks that were getting generated. Some of those shots were just simply not going down. We did have a league-wide, and it maintains right now at the time of this recording to not have fully updated stats coming out of this. So we'll just have to speak a little bit in broad strokes without the specifics. We obviously know that Kevin Durant in that fourth quarter came back in just about the 6.5-minute mark to lead, as I said at the top there, the 23-7 run that ended up ultimately spelling the victory for the Brooklyn Nets. And you saw in a game, in two games now, where the Brooklyn Nets have only one superstar on the court, but there's still a gravity that Kevin Durant has when he is on the floor. And you saw this specifically when he got back in the fourth quarter. The defense kept gravitating towards him, could not fully get themselves to stay home on their assignments. And that allowed for some real opportunities for drives into the lane, kicks into the corner. Joe Harris got one to go down and a couple to miss. But even on some of those misses, you had Royce O'Neal attacking the weak side of the glass and trying to fight for a rebound there. That gave an extra possession on the offensive end. And then you also had opportunities for Cam Thomas developing because of, again, the attention that is paid to Kevin Durant, to say nothing of Yuta Watanabe. All these guys that we're mentioning here, it still comes back to Kevin Durant being the catalyst. You go back to Friday night just as the reminder here of what it means for this team to have success when you are a one superstar roster with a lot of good complementary pieces. And we've talked about it before this season. Arguably, maybe we're looking at the best version of total supporting cast here for the Brooklyn Nets. But when you go back to that Friday night game where Kevin Durant led the Brooklyn Nets in scoring, had him at 28 points. Want to make sure I got that correct. 28 points on 10 of 21 shooting in that game. What was really nice as well, obviously, is that you got Royce O'Neal with 13. You had Nicholas Claxton, right back on track. Couple of quiet games in there, mixed in the start of the season, right back on track tonight. 18 points for him on Friday night, came right back in with that same energy in this one. And again, Sumner was a contributor. Watanabe gave you double digits. Now, the Friday night game gets a little bit muddled because it's a blowout and you get to sit down a lot of your starters and you get into some of the garbage time. In tonight's game, however, it became critical that everyone played their part. But ultimately, it started with Kevin Durant in this one. I can only give you the best version of what this box score looks like when we currently pull it up, which is to say, I think they have him at 16 minutes to this point. As soon as it gets up there, we'll obviously try to update it. But by and large, that fourth quarter, and there was a great sequence where, first and foremost, it was about Kevin Durant drawing the attention of the defense and providing opportunities for others. However, there was also a really good look there when he missed from the outside, long rebound, fell into the lane. Joe Harris swept in there to pick it up, came out to him near the top of the key. Really didn't have to do a lot of work for it, but Kevin Durant calling for it immediately, the kick to the right side, knocks down that triple. There's an emotion that we've seen, especially from Kevin Durant in this one, really fired up, especially in some of these key sequences for himself and also for teammates that are playing their role, that are doing it the right way, that are getting the job done. And you're seeing it if you're watching some of the highlights as that one closes out. You had Kevin Durant knocking down what ended up being that little wing jumper on the left baseline there that effectively made it at that point in the game. I want to see if I can get this right. That's going to make it 96-92. You would have one more bucket from Charlotte, and then that was the quick, trying to set themselves up with a 2-for-1, gave themselves the opportunity, and then it came down to Cam Thomas, which we'll talk about here in a second. But I really liked first quarter, second quarter, fourth quarter. Third quarter, still a little bit of that clunkiness where they get a little bit committed to that ISO ball, right? You saw Kevin Durant have it happen a few possessions there. And then, as we'll talk about in a second, the performance from Cam Thomas. But this one ultimately closes out on an inbounds pass. Cam Thomas holds it, shows strength, fights through the double team, gets himself into the paint, works his way through. Plumlee ultimately gives him a little bit of a two-handed shove to fully commit the foul because the refs were waiting on that a little bit. And then he goes to the line, knocks them both down, makes it a two-possession game, and effectively puts this one away for the Brooklyn Nets. So a really strong 2 games here for the Nets with everything else that's going on right now. I think that, listen, whether or not you think that Kyrie Irving is going to come back in 5 games and they're going to get themselves on track, whether or not you think Ime Udoka is going to get hired today and come in here and start to turn this thing around, Ben Simmons is going to get healthy, whatever it may look like, all of those everything else, you still have to win some of these ball games here early in the season because the Brooklyn Nets with that win get themselves to 4-6. Remember, just 2 games ago, they're 2-6. You have a 5-game suspension for Kyrie. You have a knee soreness injury for Ben Simmons. He's not available. You have Seth Curry just getting back out there on the court for the first time tonight. I think, had a couple of looks that went down, had some misses. Going to need some time to get his legs underneath him as well. There's a lot of variables here for this team to still go out and be able to have success. So you got to find ways to manufacture that a little bit. And I think they were able to do so tonight. Obviously, most importantly, getting that win. Coming up here in a second, though, want to talk about Cam Thomas's performance in both of these games. Some of the differences that we can talk about with interim head coach Jacques Vaughn, the man with the beard chomping on the gum on the sidelines, and how some of these role players have worked well over these last 2 games, but also what are some of the things that we're noticing, I think, that there's going to need to be adjustments with here in terms of rotations, in terms of functionality. Almost all glowingly positive, but again, as we work our way towards that 15 to 20 game sample size we talked about before developing some concrete thoughts, which who knows if we'll ever be able to get there this season, there are some nice takeaways that we can look at beyond Kevin Durant's performance as, again, 98-94 leading them to victory. Back in a second with some continuing breakdowns of the back-to-back wins for the Brooklyn Nets over the Wizards and the Hornets. Okay, so a couple of the key guys that I wanted to talk about here, obviously Cam Thomas. So it's funny because you go back to the offseason, go back to the summer league, and Doug and I have talked about this. There is a theme here that I want to tap into when it comes to the young players and role players, and sometimes the way I personally get myself hyped up on these guys. I want to see them do well. Like I want to see these guys do well. Back when Cam Thomas was drafted, I thought about it first in the moment as, was that really what the Brooklyn Nets needed at that time with that iteration of the team? But then you understand he's a microwave scorer. He can get out there. He can give you buckets off the bench. Okay. Then you have some of these stretches during his rookie season with injuries and everything else that you start to get a taste of what he's capable of. Fast forward to this offseason, though, you heard the then head coach Steve Nash saying, hey, we need him to do more of the other things that a guard is going to do, maybe a point guard is going to do, right? Facilitate, set up teammates, knock down perimeter shots, play under control. What I did find interesting, though, is we didn't see any Cam Thomas to start this year. He was effectively buried. Now, sometimes necessity is the mother of invention when you have to have somebody out there. And we got great games on Friday night from Edmund Sumner. We're starting to see some of the things. Talked with Tony East from Locked On Pacers and said, hey, this kid's healthy. He's a player. You saw a little bit of that, right? You saw that explosiveness. But when it comes to Cam Thomas, all of a sudden he gets out there and again had a number of assists in this game here. We're going to go ahead and try to look at it in totality, just so we can give you a sense from that last game too. And again, some of this stuff was coming in garbage time, but I was impressed by Cam Thomas overall, just in terms of playing under control, playing smart basketball, trying to set up teammates, and doing the both and, right? Yes, you want to look for your shot, but it can't be. And we saw a little bit of this at the start of the fourth quarter when the Nets were trying to get back in it, that ISO ball getting caught down into 10, 13 seconds on the shot clock, finally initiating offense, driving into the lane a little bit without an agenda, really. But by and large, we've seen him do everything effectively, right? Get into the paint and set up others. Look to provide opportunities for teammates. That's something that he needs to do. I'm just really fascinated that, because you can say with Kyrie Irving on the court here, you don't need necessarily to go to him. But you didn't have Seth Curry and you didn't have Joe Harris to start the year. And you have Patty Mills, but he's been up and down, knocked down some nice triples in this one, as Uncle Patty's going to do for you, right? We used to have Uncle Joe, Joe Johnson back in the day. Now maybe it's and we had Uncle Jeff as well. Now it's Uncle Patty, I think. He had some nice looks in this, but there was clearly a void to be filled, and you would think that Cam Thomas would be in line to get some of those minutes. Steve Nash gets fired. Jacque Vaughn, as an interim head coach, immediately taps to him when obviously you have the absence of Kyrie Irving. But again, there still should be some minute shares that are there for him that he's capable of filling in. So I thought it was interesting just that you all of a sudden see him come off the bench, see him get a real opportunity. When we backtrack just to that Washington game where we have the full clear sample size of him, 6 of 13 from the field, 2 of 4 from beyond the arc, got to the line 3 times, knocked those down, 4 rebounds. Most importantly, though, 6 assists in that game, had another handful tonight. So again, play that complete game, give a picture of a player that can do it all, not just be, and again, 3-level score, sure, but you weren't doing it from the outside last season. You weren't doing it in some small sample sizes early in this one. So you got to be able to knock down those perimeter looks when they come to you. Got to be able to play a complete game. If you can be a speed bump, if you can be an irritant on the defensive end, that's enough. Because you got a couple of guys like Patty Mills and others like Joe Harris, who has the size, but is obviously playing effort defense, not necessarily skill. You have to be able to show that you can do that because there are offensive weapons on this team. You need to be able to give the full phase game. So I like what I saw from him. The other big guy here, obviously, in this one is Yuta Watanabe. And the reason why I started out by saying I get swept up in narratives, right? So when we think about Cam Thomas and then you watch this ride go, ultimately, when they drafted him, I thought, it might not have been the way I would have gone with that particular pick. However, I like what this kid can develop into. You obviously know he's a scorer. You want to see him get opportunities. I wanted to see him get more opportunities last year. I thought if you want to, put something at the feet of Steve Nash, very inconsistent minutes. There was a lot of up and down and players in and out and all kinds of things to deal with if you were the Nets last season from a coaching perspective. And also, Once you commit to playing him 15, 20, 25 minutes, you can't then drop him down to 6, 7, and 8 in the last month of the season. You got to find a way for a kid that came out of college playing full minutes, being a starter full time. You got to find a way to give him some success opportunities. So interesting to see how that goes forward for him. Yuta Watanabe, though, when they signed him, I was absolutely elated that they had him on this roster. When I went and watched those games, as we're just checking in to see if we get this update on the stat lines here, when I went in and watched those games from Toronto, and again, max minutes he's played is averaging 14, per game, but he's never played on a team with the likes of a Kevin Durant. And all of a sudden, when we go back and we think about the moves that were made, right? Royce O'Neal and Edmund Sumner and maybe TJ Warren at some point here. Markieff Morris, okay, veteran presence, had an aggressive, as Ryan Rucco said, aggressive rebound there late in this one to secure. He's giving some type of emotional push for this team. But Yuta Watanabe does, and we've said this before, he does everything just enough. And I don't mean that negatively, because you can be an excellent rebounder, but a terrible shooter. You can be a pretty good perimeter shooter, but not a great ball handler, right? Yuta Watanabe is long enough. His shot is there. His rebounding is there. His defensive, not only skill set, but acumen is there. This guy, you're going to see, in my opinion, as this season evolves, I think you're just going to start to see more and more of him, which, by the way, in a game when you don't have Ben Simmons for his defensive purposes, but then we've also talked about offensively, defensively with a player like Nick Claxton. That's what Yuta Watanabe gives you. He gives you size and also shooting. So they went with you can call small ball with him at the 5 here as this one closed itself out, and really gave the Brooklyn Nets an opportunity to spread the floor. And that's a big difference when you're talking about, one, only having Kevin Durant as your best player, as the superstar player on this team. But when you're surrounding him with other perimeter shooters, the last thing you want to do is waste a body. And that's not knocking Nick Claxton. He has been absolutely phenomenal this year. But late in games, when you're up and on the offensive end, you want to find ways to kind of create a little bit of success. And Jacque Vaughn did some things, switching out, brought in Patty Mills for free throw shooting. That's really late in the closing moments of this one. But by and large, you want to keep guys that have to respect. So I won't have those rotations in front of me here until we get some updates on the stat lines. But when you're talking about, there's something they didn't like, which we'll talk about in a second. But when you're thinking about having a Kevin Durant, a Yuta Watanabe, a Joe Harris, Cam Thomas in this instance, maybe it's a Royce O'Neal, maybe it's a Sumner, but you're talking about having everybody that can shoot from anywhere on the floor. That changes the dynamic, right? Even if Yuta Watanabe is being your pseudo 5 and playing down in the low block or flashing in the lane, when he comes out of there and comes out high and sets a screen, you don't know, is Kevin Durant going to take that one and drive the basket? Is he going to get into the lane and kick to the corners for a perimeter shooter? Or is he going to use that screen and then feed back to Yuta Watanabe? And this can be Joe Harris setting that screen. This can even be, to an extent, Markieff Morris setting that screen, right? But when you have someone that's capable of pulling the trigger from the outside, now the defense has to respect that, and you can't do. I was thinking about this in the moment. I don't know if you guys remember those collapsible, for anyone on YouTube, those little collapsible balls. They were those little toys, right? Multicolored. They would expand out and contract down, expand out and contract down. Well, that's what, as we're going to talk about that defensively for Brooklyn in a second. But what do you get to do a little bit easier if you're an opposing defense? Contract down with Kevin Durant into the lane, make it congested, make it more difficult for him, be closer on some of those elbow jumpers in mid-range games. The more shooters you have around him, the harder it is. And Yuta Watanabe specifically in this one rewarded his teammates. Cam Thomas on one, Kevin Durant on another. I believe it may have been Joe Harris on one of them, knocking down those shots. And in the early days of the season, when Joe Harris is still getting his legs underneath him, hasn't been perfect by any stretch, has been doing a lot of things to grunt work because the perimeter shot hasn't quite been there. Seth Curry just getting back onto the court. You need somebody who kind of has a little bit of ice in his veins. And to this point, and we've seen it a little bit from Royce O'Neal at times too, right? We know Patty Mills at least has that experience, that pedigree in him. Yuta Watanabe doesn't shy away from those shots. That's a big deal to have another guy like that that has the confidence and now is giving the sample size to Kevin Durant that, hey, you can trust me, you can rely on me in these moments. We're going to talk a little bit more, I think, about what is a main theme for these last two games and the style of Kevin Durant going back to last year and now carrying over into this sample size and what it could mean going forward. We come back in with that next. All right, so little to no chance that I am not probably out over my skis here in terms of the pace of this show and the way that I'm talking because one, I'm obviously flying solo, and Doug Noor will be back in next week. A couple of little notes around the podcast as well. We have at least two, maybe even three really good guests coming up this week. Going to give a global perspective on the Nets, going to talk about things on the court and off the court. Where is this season potentially ultimately going? So be sure to stick around for those, obviously. But when we look at what it could mean going forward for this team, and we will just briefly touch on it, right? We understand Doug and I came in. He was able to actually hop on with me, which was absolutely awesome because when some of the bigger storylines break, we always want to be able to give you our combined perspective on it. But when it ultimately came out that Kyrie Irving was going to be suspended for 5 games, I don't know if we were on for him to issue. About 4 hours later, he issued an Instagram apology, took responsibility, said that he was sorry, and was focused on his Jewish brothers and sisters and the healing process, or that's what he wanted to be or should have been focused on, as opposed to feeling frustrated by being labeled with the anti-Semitic tag coming off of the promotion of that video on social media. That being the case, we know where that is, and we're not going to sidestep it or skirt around it, but we're going to have some people on to discuss it further as it unfolds here. We don't know what happens next. Doug and I left it as, do we think that Kyrie Irving plays for Brooklyn again? What I think you want to try to, get a little glimmer of hope around these two games, again, understanding what the competition level is that Kevin Durant, and we saw this last year when he was surrounded by a bunch of rookies, that seems to get him charged up. Now, does that mean that the team is better without Kyrie Irving? Of course not. As Doug would say, team's not better without James Harden, not better without Kyrie Irving, not better without Kevin Durant, right? You're not better without your best players. However, it is nice to see that there is a version of basketball that the Brooklyn Nets can play successfully, even if they are a one superstar team. And that includes the idea of what's going to happen with Ben Simmons. We have no idea, right? But is it sustainable? Is it going to work against the best teams in the league? We saw the Nets were falling apart in the third quarter in this one, right? And it's a back-to-back and all those other things. And there's probably an emotional kind of drain here coming for this team as well with everything that's gone on. But it's just nice to see that you have contributing role players that can get the job done, that you still have this little thing called TJ Warren that maybe a month from now, maybe not, but if he can come back, all of a sudden you have another scorer, another contributor. And if Cam Thomas is maybe going to start to put it together here and get the opportunity, you can start to just see pieces here and the way that this team could potentially still be successful. If you rewound this a year ago, and one of the big takeaways coming out of this game that I had too was, you wind this back a year ago, the team just flat out isn't athletic enough, right? Patty Mills, not athletic enough, too small, gets picked on defensively, can't do much on the offensive end outside of the perimeter shot, right? You have Joe Harris. You love his perimeter shot. You like his size because you're a small team, and he does enough on the defensive end, but he's not an athlete. He's not going to do, by the way, an athlete by the highest level of NBA standards, not by you're in the NBA and Joe Harris could run circles around me if you needed that caveat. But you know that there's limitations there. And then you don't have a lot of size. And then you got the James Johnsons of the world, and you've got the Blake Griffins, right? The constitution of the team just was not balanced in a way that even if you're not the best player on the court or you're not the best player in the matchup, athleticism gets you a long way, right? Edmund Sumner is not the perfect player, but he gets shot out of a bottle rocket. He gets downhill in a hurry, attacks at the basket, draws some fouls, and has some pretty nice length on the defensive end and is quick enough to try to stay with some assignments, right? That matters. a guy like Cam Thomas and his evolution, obviously we know what he's capable of on the offensive end. That matters. Putting a ball in someone's hands and saying you can go create for yourself, getting him more involved is going to matter here. Yuta Watanabe, the length matters defensively. We had some guys with size last year. Problem was they couldn't stay in front of anybody, right? So that, like, all of a sudden you look at this roster, and I know I've said this before, and I'll continue to, I think, say this as a theme all year. They just seem to have elevated their athleticism across 4 or 5 positions, top to bottom throughout the rotation, and that makes a massive difference. One guy that was got sent down for G League assignment was Kessler Edwards. And while we love him and we can think about his long-term development, again, not the most athletic player. It's why he goes in the second round, not the first round, right? So all of a sudden you can kind of see how, at least in this offseason, unlike last year, but 2 years ago or going back to the creation of it all, Sean Marks did a much better job filling out this roster with players that can come in and contribute regardless of whether or not you have 3 superstars on the floor or 2 superstars, right? As long as you have Kevin Durant, you're going to be able to have a lot of success. So I thought that that was really important. Brief reminder here that after this wraps up, we'll stick around for a few minutes. I'm sure everyone's in there. Appreciate everybody that is in the live YouTube chat. We'll stick around for a few minutes. We'll chop it up a little bit. Won't be as long as usual because I'm going to be out of breath by that point. Bottom line being, as the Brooklyn Nets win 98-94 over the Charlotte Hornets and get their back-to-back wins here, it'll be interesting to see what comes next, because the Ime Udoka contract and signing and becoming the new head coach of the Nets, that effectively got put on pause here, understandably. And there was one other little thing just to put in here, as the Brooklyn Nets will have some time off and then are going to come back in on Monday night, where they're going to play. I had it up in front of me here a second ago. Now I've lost track of it. I'll try to get that back up here in a second to tell you that they're going to be playing Dallas. So maybe a revenge opportunity here. As we know, they lost earlier in the season, 129-125 to Dallas. Now they will go to Dallas to finish out the 3-game road trip. They lost at home to Dallas. Now we'll go on the road to try to revenge that game. That's going to be a 9:45. Good Lord. I don't like the sound of that at all, friends, but that'll be on Monday night. So we'll see how they fare against them. That will mark the 3rd of the minimum 5-game suspension that Kyrie Irving is serving. One last thing that I will just say, and then we'll get into the after party here on YouTube, is that just to round out the information that came out, essentially there was an intention from, it sounds like, GM Sean Marks and pressure from the league immediately following everything, that they wanted Kyrie Irving to be suspended immediately. Right, wrong, indifferent, however you may feel about any angle of it, that's what was being pushed for. And it was actually Joe Tsai who said he wanted to use restraint, sit down and talk with Kyrie Irving. What we're hearing is that he kept pushing the timeline to have that conversation because Kyrie Irving was not getting back in touch with him and not coming to meet with him to have the discussion. So finally, when push came to shove, quote unquote, they end up going forward with a suspension. Kyrie issues his apology, and we don't know where that stands now. Sean Marks, in interviews when they were down in Washington as well, said there's going to be a process by which and benchmarks that they're going to want Kyrie Irving to reach before they will consider reinstatement with the team, which includes meeting with community leaders, meeting with members of the Jewish community, and beginning and continuing an education process. These are paraphrasing the words of Sean Marks. We'll see where that goes. But I will just say, as we had mentioned on our live coverage of that the other day, when they say he is not fit to be associated with the Brooklyn Nets, we said it then, I'm just going to reiterate it. That is pretty heavy language, right? So I don't know what comes next here as far as the relationship between Kyrie Irving and the organization, but you don't say those things. You don't frame it that way unless you have a very specific stance that you're taking, a very specific opinion that you're holding, and a very specific set of standards that you want a player to get back to. However you feel about it, this is the bottom line. Kyrie Irving is going to have to do a lot, it looks like, in order to get back potentially in the good graces of the Brooklyn Nets. And I don't know, how long that could extend. We will see. And we'll obviously keep you up to date on that. In the meantime, though, the Brooklyn Nets improved to 4-6. They will have the road game against Dallas, which will conclude their 3-game road trip. After that, they do get the benefit of coming home to take on, hey, crosstown rivals, the New York Knicks, which will be a good one before heading back out on the road, though. So it's only a pit stop back at home there. It's actually a pretty long stretch for them. So these 3 games, obviously the back-to-back with Washington and Charlotte, followed up by Dallas. They'll come home for New York, and then it's on the road at LA for the Clippers, then the Lakers, then the Kings. So the California swing. They'll head up to Portland to take on the Trailblazers, and then they'll come back. Wow, what a stretch here. Absolutely brutal. They'll come back to take on Memphis at home, and then right back out on the road for Philadelphia, Toronto, and Indiana, Friday, November 25th, the day after Thanksgiving. That means that the Brooklyn Nets right now are in the middle of a 3-7-10 out of 12 on the road. And remember, they did have 5 of their first 7 at home. Unfortunately, they didn't do a great job taking advantage of that. So really big road stretch here. And then they do get an absolutely, regardless of competition, a really nice setup where they're going to have 6 consecutive games at home from November 28th all the way through December 9th. So a really nice stretch. Depending on what happens with Ime Udoka, if he gets in, you can just start to think about what are the timelines going to be here. And potentially, as we get into December, maybe starting to sniff around some indication around what could happen with TJ Warren. These 2 games do not solve everything. They maybe don't solve anything. But in a season that literally went off the rails from game number 1 on and off the court, it's just nice to be able to talk back-to-back games of winning basketball for the Brooklyn Nets with Kevin Durant leading the charge. We will be back in on Monday night following the Dallas Mavericks game for another post-game live session. Be sure to check that out, as well as look and keep your eyes and ears open for a couple of special guests coming up this week, which we will announce when they are official and locked in. As you know, when Doug Norrie is not here, I first tell you to get over to YouTube, subscribe. We always enjoy the comments, the conversations we're getting into in the post-game live sessions. You can obviously get the podcast for free on wherever you get those platforms. Obviously, subscribe and rate it. It's totally free for you, but it really helps us. And we are always, as Doug says, and we continue to be, greatly appreciative of the support that we get from the Brooklyn Nets fan base. And we would just love it. And we are always amazed by the growth that we continue to see. We want to keep doing it. And then, without Doug being here, there is no quote short of saying, I miss my friend, and I can't wait till he's back so we can keep talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball.